In the remote foothills of Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains 2023, a band of horse thieves was about to make the deadliest mistake of their lives. When they set their sights on the prized Appaloosas at the Sullivan Widows Ranch, they thought they'd found an easy mark, just another isolated homestead run by a grieving woman who couldn't possibly defend her property. They couldn't have been more wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that Marion Sullivan wasn't just any widow trying to keep her late husband's ranch alive. For nearly 15 years, she'd been known as the Echo Hunter in military and law enforcement circles, a woman who had trained elite snipers in audio targeting techniques before losing her sight in an IED explosion during her final deployment. Marion could track a moving target in complete darkness and shoot with deadly accuracy using sound alone. Deep in the sprawling wilderness of Clearwater Valley, where the Powder River carved its path through towering peaks, Marion Sullivan's story was about to remind these rustlers why some legends are best left undisturbed. This wasn't just another tale of theft and vengeance. This was about how the region's most notorious horse thieves were about to learn they'd stolen from a woman who could outshoot any man without seeing a thing, and she was about to prove it. As dawn broke over Clearwater Valley, Marion Sullivan stood on her wraparound porch, her trusted Winchester rifle resting easily in weathered hands. At 43, she moved with the precise, measured grace that had once made her legendary in military circles. Her copper hair, now threaded with silver at the temples, was swept back in a practical braid. Her clouded green eyes, hidden behind tinted glasses, stared unseeingly at the horizon, not out of habit but necessity. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats from the corral caught her attention. Whiskey, her chestnut quarter-horse stallion, paced restlessly in his enclosure, his movements agitated and unusual for the early hour. Marion tilted her head slightly, a gesture she'd developed to better capture and process sounds. Something had disturbed him. "Easy there, boy," she called, her voice carrying across the morning air. The stallion's nervous movements continued, his hooves striking the ground in an uneven pattern that told Marion more than words could. Whiskey was more than just a horse. He was Thomas's final gift to her, specially chosen and trained to work with a blind rider after her injury. His bloodline was exceptional, a blend of quarter-horse speed and Appaloosa endurance. Thomas had spent months finding the right breeding pair, knowing that Marion would appreciate the horse's intelligence and responsiveness. Now, listening to Whiskey's anxious movements, Marion felt her own instincts sharpen. Years of training had taught her to trust what others might dismiss, the subtle shifts in animal behavior, the slight changes in wind patterns, the almost imperceptible sounds that signaled approaching danger. The sharp crack of a twig breaking in the distance confirmed her suspicions. The sound came from the direction of the North Ridge, approximately 200 yards out. Too deliberate for wildlife, too cautious for a friendly visitor, Marion's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her rifle. "Marion!" The call came from the direction of the road, a familiar voice that momentarily drew her attention away from the potential threat. Jacob Freeman, who ran the neighboring ranch, appeared at her fence line. The son of one of the first black ranchers in the territory, Jacob had built his reputation through hard work and exceptional horsemanship, earning respect in a region that wasn't always welcoming to outsiders. "Heard about the Wilson place?" he called out, dismounting smoothly from his horse. Marion turned toward his voice, her head tilted in that characteristic way that helped her locate sound. "What about it?" "Rustlers hit it last night, took their best horses, including that new paint stallion they brought up from Colorado." Jacob approached, his voice lowering as he reached the porch steps. "Third ranch this month. The sheriff thinks it's the Redwood." Crew moving into the territory. Marion's hands stilled on her rifle. The Redwood Crew. She knew the name. Professional horse thieves who'd been working their way up from Colorado, leaving empty stables and occasionally dead ranchers in their wake. They operated with military precision, studying their targets and executing their thefts with calculated efficiency. "Tell me more," she said, her voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the alertness that now coursed through her. "They're organized, Marion. Professional, not like the usual rustlers we get through here." Jacob climbed the steps, his boots making distinctive sounds on the wooden porch that Marion had memorized over years of friendship. "They study their targets, know exactly what they're after. The Wilson boy said they moved like shadows. In and out in 15 minutes, taking only their best breeding stock." "They've killed?" Marion asked, though she already knew the answer. "4 ranchers over in Idaho Territory. Nobody's even gotten a good look at them. They come at night, disable security systems, knock out power if necessary. Some of the smaller ranches don't even know they've been hit until morning." Marion nodded slowly, processing the information while simultaneously tracking the presence she'd detected earlier. The trespasser was still there, now moving parallel to the property line. Approximately 230 yards out, the sound of weight shifting on dry pine needles was distinct to her trained ear. "You're out here alone," Jacob began, then caught himself as Marion's expression shifted. "I know you can handle yourself, but maybe consider bringing some of your horses closer to the house, especially Whiskey and those new Appaloosas. Word of their bloodlines has spread." Marion ran her hand along her rifle's barrel, a gesture that had once been part of her training routine in the military. "The day I let fear change how I run this ranch is the day I should sell it and move back east." Jacob sighed, knowing better than to argue. He'd seen Marion handle trouble before. Last winter, she'd dropped 2 wolves at 200 yards to protect her cattle, shooting at nothing but the sound of their movements through the snow. But this was different. Just be careful. These men, they're not regular rustlers. They've got a system and they're not afraid to kill to protect it. After Jacob rode off, Marion returned to her house, her movements deliberately measured, despite the unease his words had stirred. In her bedroom, she opened a cedar chest that hadn't been touched in months. Inside lay her old military equipment, specialized audio enhancement gear designed for nocturnal operations, along with custom ammunition she'd developed for sound targeting. Beneath these items rested the medals and commendations from her service, tangible reminders of a life she'd left behind when she came home blind from her final tour. Marion closed the chest without removing anything. She'd chosen this quiet life when she married Thomas, trading the military precision of her former career for the peace of the valley. The woman known as the Echo Hunter had disappeared the day she returned to civilian life. But as she moved through her morning chores, she found herself listening with renewed intensity to the terrain around her ranch, to the places where the broken country provided cover for those with bad intentions. The Redwood Crew might be professionals, but they were about to learn that in Clearwater Valley, things weren't always what they seemed. A simple widow's ranch might just turn out to be the deadliest ground they'd ever tried to steal from, because while the Echo Hunter might have retired, she'd never stopped practicing. Every morning for the past 7 years, she'd maintained her skills, not for military operations, but for moments exactly like this. Marion's shots echoed off the valley walls as she put 3 rounds through an empty can at 150 yards, tracking. Nothing but the sound of the light breeze moving it where she'd hung it from a distant tree. She hadn't planned to practice today, but Jacob's warning had stirred something in her blood. The familiar weight of the rifle, the smell of gunpowder, the satisfaction of hearing the perfect ping of each hit. "You're still the best I've ever seen," Thomas had told her the first time they met, after a demonstration she'd given for law enforcement officers in Atlanta. He wasn't like other men who approached her afterward with challenges or disbelief. Thomas Sullivan had watched her performance with genuine appreciation, understanding that her abilities weren't just impressive, they were revolutionary. The target practice was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the eastern trail. Marion lowered her rifle, identifying the distinctive pattern of multiple horses. 3 riders, she calculated, based on the alternating rhythm of their approach. "Mrs. Sullivan!" Marion recognized the voice immediately. Dr. Sarah Collins, accompanied by the sound of her medical bag bouncing against her saddle. Unlike many in the territory, Sarah had pursued her medical degree against significant obstacles, establishing a practice that served the rural communities throughout the valley. "We were hoping to find you here," Sarah continued as she dismounted, her boots making a lighter sound on the ground than her companions. Marion set her rifle aside, turning toward the approaching footsteps. "What brings you all this way?" "The Wilson raid," a young male voice spoke up. "Billy Thompson from the general store." His voice still cracked occasionally, revealing his youth. "Pa sent me to tell you one of the Wilson hands got a look at their leader. Says he has a distinctive way of operating, cuts all communication first, works in patterns like military clearing operations." "That fits with what Jacob said about their precision," Marion observed, the pieces clicking into place in her mind. Dr. Collins dismounted, her voice grave as she approached. "There's more, Marion. The hand who saw them, he recognized the leader, says it's Ryan Harlow." The name hit Marion like a physical blow. Memories flooded back. A specialized training program in Virginia 7 years ago, before her final deployment. A decorated Special Forces operative who challenged her training methods, claiming her audio targeting techniques were unnecessarily complex. She'd outshot him so thoroughly in the darkness that his credibility had been damaged. "You know him?" asked the third visitor, whom Marion now identified as Deputy Michael Carter. "We met once," Marion said carefully. "He wasn't the kind of man who takes humiliation well." "That's putting it mildly," Dr. Collins added. "After discharge, he led a private security team in Texas, got his whole unit blacklisted after a botched operation. Excessive force, civilian casualties. Private firms won't touch him now." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Deputy Carter leaned forward, his keys jingling slightly at his belt, a sound Marion had learned to associate with him. "They say he's got 15 men now, all ex-military or former security contractors. Been working there, way up from Colorado, taking the finest horses they can find, using tactical approaches, sending scouts ahead to study their targets." Marion's mind raced. If Harlow was behind the thefts, this wasn't just about stealing horses. The man she'd encountered in Virginia had been rigid, prideful, with a cold fury in his voice that spoke of deeper instabilities. A man like that? Nursing. A grudge for 7 years. He wouldn't just steal her horses, he'd want to destroy everything she'd built. "There's something else," Sarah said softly. "The Wilson hand who recognized Harlow. He was found this morning. Someone put a bullet in his head during the night. Clean shot, professional. No witnesses, no casings left behind." Marion absorbed this information, her hand unconsciously moving to her rifle. Harlow was eliminating witnesses, ensuring no one could warn his future targets. But he'd made a mistake. He didn't know she already knew him, already understood what kind of man she was dealing with. "Billy," she turned to the boy, "ride back to town. Tell your father I'll be in later to pick up my supplies. Dr. Collins, Deputy Carter, I appreciate the warning." After they rode off, Marion returned to her rifle practice with renewed focus. Each shot deliberate, precise. She wasn't just maintaining skills now, she was preparing. Harlow might have 15 men, military training, and a decade of bitter hatred driving him, but he'd forgotten something crucial about their encounter. In Virginia, she hadn't just outshot him that day. She'd done it in complete darkness, using only sound to guide her shots, a feat he'd failed to match even with night vision equipment. His humiliation had been complete, not just beaten, but beaten by a woman, in front of a room of special forces, operators and intelligence officials. Now he was in her territory, threatening her neighbors, killing innocent men. If he was working his way through the valley's finest horses, Whiskey and her Appaloosas would be on his list. The thought of Harlow's hands anywhere near Thomas's final gift sent a cold fury through her veins. Marion reloaded her rifle, tracking a more distant target by sound alone. The Echo Hunter had been more than just a military nickname. It had been a testament to her unique abilities, her precision, her capacity for justice when needed. She'd hung up the name when she married Thomas, choosing a quieter life, but perhaps it was time for the Echo Hunter to make one final appearance. Because if Harlow thought he was hunting an aging blind widow living alone with prize horses, he was about to learn a harsh lesson. He wasn't the hunter here. In these mountains, on this land she knew like her own heartbeat, he was about to become the prey. The bustling streets of Riverwood held more secrets than most frontier towns. But none quite like the truth behind Marion Sullivan's past. As she rode Whiskey into town that afternoon, the usual whispers followed her progress. Most knew her only as Thomas Sullivan's blind widow, the quiet rancher who kept to herself but somehow managed her property with surprising efficiency. But old Frank Dawson, watching from his hardware store porch, knew better. Frank had been there in Virginia 8 years ago when the Echo Hunter first made her name in military circles. He'd been a training officer for special operations units, and he'd never forgotten the sight of Lieutenant Marion Reeves, as she was known then, emerging from pitch darkness to hit targets that seasoned operators had missed completely. Now, watching her dismount with that same fluid precision, Frank remembered other things too. The night 3 skeptical generals had tried to prove her methods were smoke and mirrors, challenging her to locate and disable mock explosive devices in total darkness. Marion had found and neutralized each one in record time, then calmly explained the subtle audio signatures that had guided her. "Mrs. Sullivan," Frank called out as she passed, Whiskey's reins held loosely in her hand, "might have something you'd want to see." Marion followed the direction of his voice into his hardware store. The distinctive smell of metal, leather and oil filled the space, smells she'd learned to associate with Frank's establishment. She heard him rummaging through a drawer behind the counter. "Found these while cleaning," Frank said quietly, setting something on the counter with a gentle metallic sound. "Thought you might want them. What with the Redwood crew in the territory?" Marion's fingertips explored the objects, specially designed sound amplifiers that were attached to standard military headsets. They were an early prototype of equipment. She had helped develop devices that could isolate and enhance specific audio frequencies to aid in targeting. "You know about Redwood?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Remember Harlow, too," Frank replied. "That final qualification test in Virginia. He wasn't just any operator. He was known for pushing technology over skill, believing equipment could replace proper training, said your methods were outdated, unnecessarily complex." "I remember," Marion said softly. "He argued that advanced night vision and thermal imaging made audio targeting redundant." Frank's voice dropped lower. "After you bested him, he tried to claim you had inside information on the course layout, said no one could navigate by sound alone with that precision. Colonel Westfield himself had to step in when Harlow tried to sabotage your next demonstration." Marion's fingers paused on the amplifiers. "He cut the power to my audio equipment. If I hadn't checked it beforehand—" "That's not all." Frank pulled out what sounded like paper, a newspaper clipping from its rustling quality. "Year after your demonstration, Harlow led a high-profile security operation in Honduras. Wasn't even supposed to use lethal force, had explicit orders to extract a hostage without casualties. Instead, he went in hot, killed everyone, including The hostage claimed his equipment malfunctioned, couldn't distinguish targets properly. Marion's fingers traced the familiar equipment. Why are you showing me this, Frank? Because folks need to know what's really coming. Frank met her clouded eyes directly. Harlow's not just after horses. A man like that, carrying a grudge this long, he's after blood. The Miller boy wasn't his first kill. 2 ranchers in Colorado tried to stop his gang, both found shot with military precision. Their horses weren't just stolen, they were poisoned afterward, like he was sending a message. The bell above the shop door chimed as someone entered. Marion recognized the light footsteps immediately. Dr. Collins. Marion, Sarah greeted her, then stopped short at the sight of the military equipment. Those are yours? From your service? Days? Prototypes, Marion acknowledged. Early versions of what became standard issue for certain units. I had a brother in special operations, Sarah said softly. He told me stories about the Echo Hunter. Said you revolutionized how they approached night operations. Frank nodded. She didn't just teach them to shoot in the dark. She taught them to truly listen, changed how entire units operated. The conversation was interrupted by commotion in the street. Heavy boots pounded the wooden sidewalk as Jacob Freeman approached, his breathing rapid from exertion. Marion! Harlow's men! They hit Anderson Place last night, took every breeding mare, poisoned the well. Marion was already moving, the amplifiers forgotten. Casualties? Anderson's son took a bullet trying to stop them. Jacob's voice carried an unusual tremor. Sarah, they need you out there. Sarah grabbed her medical bag from where she'd set it. How bad? Bad enough. But Marion, Jacob paused, his voice dropping as he glanced at the equipment on the counter. Well, that explains a few things. Such as? Marion asked. Such as how? You can track animals that most people with perfect vision would miss. Such as why Thomas used to grin like a fool whenever someone mentioned military training. Jacob's expression turned serious. But it also means Harlow's working his way toward you. Anderson's place is only 8 miles from your ranch. Marion turned to Frank. Those prototype amplifiers, how many others might have designs? Military produced thousands, Frank admitted. Most are probably gathering dust in storage now, but some might have reached Harlow, Marion finished. If he's been planning this, he might know exactly whose ranch he's really targeting. Sarah grabbed her medical bag. I'll ride to Anderson's, but Marion, be careful. If Harlow knows who you are, he won't just send men, he'll want to handle this himself. Good, Marion's voice was steel, because I've got some unfinished business with the Major. As Sarah and Jacob rode out, Marion studied the equipment with her fingertips one last time. The woman in her memory stared back with fierce confidence, a reminder of who she'd been before choosing a quieter life, but that life hadn't truly gone. It had just been waiting, like a weapon in storage, for the moment it would be needed again. They say you were the best, Frank said quietly. Not just at shooting, but at reading people. Could tell when someone was about to move, when they were lying, just by the subtle changes in their breathing, the shift of their weight. The body always tells the truth, Marion replied. That's how I knew Harlow was dangerous even before the demonstration. There was something wrong in his voice, something that enjoyed causing fear. She turned to leave, but Frank caught her arm. There's more you should know. After the Honduras incident, when the agency was investigating, they found Harlow's personal effects. He kept trophies, not just from operations, but from everyone who'd ever bested him. Photos, personal items, detailed notes on their routines. You'd think he's been planning this all these years? Think he's been working up to it? Frank's voice was grim. The other horse thefts, the killings, their practice, learning the territory, testing defenses. He's not just after whiskey, Marion. He's after the woman who humiliated him, the Echo Hunter herself. Marion absorbed this information, her mind already shifting plans. If Harlow knew who she was, he'd be expecting her skills, preparing for them. But he'd be expecting the military operator, the demonstrator who worked in controlled environments with specific parameters. He wouldn't be ready for what she'd become in the years since, a woman who'd learned to use those same skills for survival. In the unpredictable wilderness of Wyoming, a woman who knew every creek, gully and rock formation on her property by the unique sounds they created. The environment itself had become an extension of her senses, in ways even her military training hadn't prepared her for. "Frank," she said finally, "I need you to send some messages. Dr. Collins first. Tell her to warn people about traveling alone. Then Jacob Freeman. His ranch hands know these ridges better than anyone. And finally, find Sheriff Donovan. He needs to know what's coming." "The sheriff won't intervene in what he considers a private matter," Frank warned. "No," Marion agreed, "but he needs to be ready when this ends, one way or another." Outside, Whiskey sensed his rider's tension, dancing slightly as she mounted. Marion calmed him with a practiced touch, remembering how she'd first learned to communicate with horses after losing her sight. Not through force like most trainers would suggest, but through understanding, through partnership. She'd developed methods of working with animals that relied on sound and touch rather than sight, creating bonds of trust that went deeper than visual communication. "One more thing," Frank called as she turned to leave. "The night Harlow tried to sabotage your demonstration, it wasn't Colonel Westfield who caught him. It was Thomas. He was working as a civilian contractor, saw Harlow near the equipment room, followed him, stopped him before he could do worse than cut the power." Marion's hands tightened on the reins. "Thomas never told me." "No, he wouldn't have." Frank's voice softened, but he knew what Harlow was, even then. "Maybe that's why he made sure you kept practicing after your injury, even after you left the service. Man like Thomas Sullivan, he'd have known someday the past might come calling." As Marion guided Whiskey down the main street of Riverwood, her mind catalogued each sound around her. The blacksmith's hammer 3 buildings down, children playing near the schoolhouse, the distinctive cadence of different horses tied at hitching posts. Years of blindness had honed her acoustic memory to remarkable precision. She could navigate the town without assistance by tracking familiar sound patterns, the unique creak of each building's porch, the particular way wind moved around street corners, the specific timbre of voices echoing off different structures. The next morning painted Clearwater Valley in shades of possibility that only Marion could detect through sound. Before the revelations in town, before Frank's warnings stirred old memories, this had been her world, carefully built, meticulously maintained, filled with the quiet satisfaction of honest work. The ranch hands wouldn't arrive for another hour, giving Marion her cherished solitude as she walked the fence line. 7 years of tending this land without sight had taught her to map it differently. Each dip and rise identified by how sound traveled across it, each hidden spring recognized by its distinctive gurgling, each sheltered hollow known by its unique acoustic signature. In the lower pasture, her small herd of cattle grazed peacefully, their movements creating recognizable patterns in the grass that Marion could track by sound. In the vegetable garden Thomas had helped her plant that first year after her injury, summer squash grew on sturdy vines. Marion knelt to check their progress, her fingers expertly assessing their readiness for harvest. "Life's not all grand operations," Thomas had said, showing her how to test soil with her hands when she'd first balked at gardening after losing her sight. "Sometimes the biggest victories are the smallest ones, grown day by day." The kitchen still held traces of his influence, the distinctive arrangement of cooking implements hanging from racks he'd installed, positioned precisely so she could identify each by touch and sound. The big cast-iron stove he'd insisted on, buying when the old one died, made a particular creaking sound as it heated that Marion had come to associate it with mornings. She stoked its fire, starting her bread-making ritual. The familiar motions of kneading dough centered her, connecting past to present. A sharp whistle from the pasture caught her attention. Through the open window, she heard young Ethan Freeman, Jacob's oldest son, arriving early to help with the horses. At 16, he shared his father's gift with animals, handling them with natural patience and grace that Marion could detect in the rhythm of his movements and the calm responses of the horses. In his care, "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Ethan called out, leading his paint mare closer to the house. "Pa sent me to help with the new foal." Marion wiped flour from her hands. In the breeding paddock, one of her mares had given birth 4 days ago. The foal, still learning its legs. Perfect timing, she needs her morning check. Together they approach the mare and foal. Ethan moved with careful confidence, speaking softly in that special tone reserved for nervous animals. The mare's ears flicked forward. Marion could hear the subtle movement, recognizing a trusted presence. "She's strong," Ethan observed, running practiced hands down the foal's legs. "Good bone structure. You've got a real talent for breeding." Mrs. Sullivan. Marion checked the foal's breathing, the sound telling her more than sight could have. "Your father taught you well." "He says you taught him better," Ethan replied with a hint of admiration. "That first year when other ranchers wouldn't sell to a black family, you not only sold him your best mare, but showed him your training methods." Marion's fingers gently explored the foal's joints, ensuring proper development. "Your father earned my respect. He understands horses aren't just property, they're partners." The morning unfolded with comfortable familiarity. More ranch hands arrived, going about their tasks with well-practiced efficiency. Marion had chosen each one carefully over the years, valuing character over experience. They were family now, loyal to the bone. By midday, the bread had cooled enough for sharing. The hands gathered on the porch, trading stories between bites. Marion sat slightly apart, listening to them with quiet pride. This was what she and Thomas had dreamed of, not just a successful ranch, but a community. Lisa Carpenter, who helped with the cattle, passed around fresh coffee. At 23, she'd fled an abusive home in Montana, finding refuge at the Sullivan Ranch. Marion had recognized something of herself in the young woman's determination, teaching her ranching skills when other places would have turned her away. "Mail came," Lisa announced, handing Marion several letters, their shapes and weights distinctive in her hands, including one from that horse buyer in Texas. Marion sorted through the correspondence, her sensitive fingertips detecting an unusual envelope among them. Inside, she found a formal invitation to demonstrate her audio targeting techniques at an upcoming law enforcement conference, promising substantial payment for an appearance by the legendary Echo Hunter. She set it aside unopened, just as she had dozens like it over the years. The afternoon brought Sarah Collins back from tending the Anderson boy. "He'll heal," she reported, accepting a cup of coffee from Lisa. But Marion Harlow's men didn't. Just steal horses. They destroyed Anderson's breeding records, his bloodline documentation. They're erasing histories. Marion nodded slowly. She'd suspected as much. Harlow wasn't just stealing valuable horses. He was systematically dismantling the foundations of each ranch he targeted. "How's Anderson taking it?" "Hard." Those records represented 3 generations of careful breeding. Sarah hesitated, lowering her voice. "There's something else. While I was there, I noticed boot prints by the records cabinet, military issue, but with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel." "Harlow himself," Marion murmured. The doctor studied her mentor carefully. "You're different today, calmer." "This is my ground," Marion explained, her voice carrying quiet confidence. "Out here, everything makes sense. The rhythms of the land, the needs of the animals, the cycle of seasons. It's all connected, all purposeful." They watched Ethan working with a young stallion in the training ring, using the gentle methods Marion had taught. The horse moved willingly, responding to subtle cues that required no visual communication. You could have kept performing, Sarah. Observed. Been famous, wealthy. I chose this life, Marion corrected, emphasizing the difference. Every morning I wake up knowing exactly who I am, what needs doing. There's peace in that. As evening approached, the hands departed for their own homes or the bunkhouse. Marion walked her evening rounds, checking each animal, securing each gate. In the gathering dusk, Whiskey nickered a greeting as she entered his paddock. The stallion's coat warmed beneath her fingertips as she checked him for any signs of distress. He was Thomas's masterpiece, the culmination of everything he'd learned about breeding and training. More than that, he represented their shared vision of how horses should be handled, with respect rather than force, with patience rather than dominance. A distant coyote's howl echoed from the mountains, answered by another closer to the ranch. Marion noted their locations automatically, part of her constant awareness of her surroundings. The coyotes rarely bothered her livestock, respecting the boundaries she'd established through selective deterrence, rather than wholesale slaughter. In her bedroom, Marion opened the chest containing her military equipment. The specialized audio gear still functioned perfectly. She could tell by the distinctive electronic hum when she activated each piece. She removed them carefully, along with the custom ammunition Thomas had helped her develop after her injury. Rounds designed to travel true even in crosswinds that might throw off standard bullets. But tonight, she wasn't seeking equipment. Instead, she removed the false bottom Thomas had installed, revealing documents he'd carefully preserved. Topographical maps of the territory marked with hidden trails and acoustic anomalies, detailed notes on sound channels and natural amplification. Points. Everything a person who navigated by sound might need if they had to defend their property. The land is your ally, Thomas had told her, teaching her to read the mountain's moods through sound. Know it better than your opponent, and you'll never truly be outnumbered. Marion replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, except for one small device, a custom-made audio amplifier designed to isolate human movement sounds from natural background noise. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight was for appreciating what she'd built here, this peaceful world of meaningful work and earned trust. If Harlow thought attacking it would break her spirit, he'd fatally misunderstood what made the Echo Hunter legendary. It wasn't the tricks or the shooting or even the navigation skills. It was the discipline beneath the demonstrations, the endless hours of practice, the absolute dedication to mastering her environment through sound. The same qualities that had made her a military asset, now made her a rancher, a neighbor, a leader worth following. Let Harlow come with his technology and bitter grudges. Show him what happened when someone threatened not just her horses, but her home, her people, everything she'd spent 7 years building. Because while the Echo Hunter might have been a military designation, the skills behind it had been forged through years of dedication. And unlike Harlow, she hadn't spent the past decade nursing old wounds. She'd spent it growing stronger, deeper, more connected to the land and people around her. He was about to learn that the woman who humiliated him in Virginia was only a shadow of who she'd become in the darkness of Clearwater Valley. The first hint of trouble came not from gunfire or hoofbeats, but from silence. As Marion inspected the upper pasture at dawn, she noticed the songbirds had stopped their morning chorus. The cattle, usually spread out grazing, huddled together near the center of the field, nature's warning signs, clear as signal fires to those who knew how to interpret them. Marion tilted her head slightly, her enhanced hearing picking up unusual sounds along the ridgeline, the faint metallic click of a scope being adjusted, quickly muffled. Someone was watching the ranch, studying patterns, learning routines, professional reconnaissance, military style. A commotion from the lower barn drew her attention. Ethan Freeman burst out, running toward her position with urgent footsteps. Mrs. Sullivan! Track marks by the east fence, fresh ones. Multiple horses moving quiet, keeping to soft ground. Marion followed him to the location, her fingers exploring the signs that Ethan described. The patterns were subtle: broken grass stems, a displaced stone, the barest impression of horseshoes in shadowed earth, but the implications were unmistakable. Scout. Party, she concluded, identifying the formation from the spacing of the tracks. Probably 3 riders, testing our awareness. Should we alert the hands? Not yet, Marion decided, her mind already mapping the intruders' likely movements. Let's keep this quiet. Best defense is letting them think they've found some blind spots. Returning to the main house, Marion found Lisa Carpenter waiting on the porch, her breathing patterns revealing tension. 2 strangers checked into the boarding. "New house last night," Lisa reported, keeping her voice low. "Mrs. Thornton says they asked peculiar questions about local ranches, especially yours." Description: former military by their bearing. One had a distinctive limp, cavalry injury from the way he favors it. The other wore his gun military style, cross-draw. They claimed to be horse buyers, but their questions focused on security arrangements, guard schedules. Marion processed this information, adding it to her mental map of gathering threats. They're establishing a perimeter, working inward. Classic military encirclement. "There's more," Lisa continued, her voice dropping further. "Dr. Collins treated a man this morning, a stranger, wouldn't give his name. Bullet graze on his arm, claiming it was a hunting accident, but Sarah noticed powder burns on his sleeve. Someone shot at him at close range within the past day. A rider approached from the town road. Marion recognized Jacob Freeman's distinctive cadence, his horse at a brisk trot rather than his usual easy pace. His approach carried a sense of urgency even before he spoke. "Strangers in town," he reported, as he dismounted. "4 men at the saloon, 2 more at the livery. They're asking about you specifically, Marion, offering gold for information." "And what are they learning?" Marion asked, her tone carrying mild amusement. Jacob managed a grim chuckle. "Dawson at the hardware store told them you moved to Oregon. Thornton at the boarding house swears you relocated to California. Seems everyone in town has a different tale about where the famous blind widow went." Marion nodded, appreciating the town's loyalty. "Any sign of Harlow himself?" "No, but there's talk about a camp in the high country. Hunters reported seeing smoke from multiple fires, hearing horses. More men than any normal outfit would need." The pieces aligned into a clear pattern. Harlow was establishing a staging area, positioning men around the valley, gathering intelligence. But he wasn't just preparing to steal horses, he was setting up a military operation. Ethan, who'd been watching the ridgeline, suddenly stiffened. Movement in the scrub oak, single rider, trying to stay hidden. Marion raised her head, assessing. The sounds drifting from that direction. The approaching rider wasn't attempting to mask the sound of their approach. This wasn't one of Harlow's men. The cadence of horse and rider together carried a familiar rhythm. "Sheriff Donovan," she identified seconds before Ethan confirmed the approaching figure. The sheriff approached openly, his horse's hooves making no attempt at stealth. "Ms. Sullivan," he called, dismounting. "Thought I should deliver this personally." He pressed a folded paper into her hand, a telegram from its feel. "Report from the Federal Marshal's office. They've been tracking Harlow's movement since Colorado. His gang's grown to nearly 20 men now, all ex-military or security contractors. They hit the Russell Ranch last night," he continued, his voice carrying the flat professional tone Marion had come to associate with him. "Russell's place is over 40 miles south. They're moving fast," Marion observed, striking targets seemingly at random. The sheriff spread a map across the porch railing. Marion could hear the rustle of the paper, smell the ink. "There's a pattern. Each raid takes the best horses, yes, but also destroys breeding records, equipment, anything that would help the ranches rebuild." Marion's fingers traced the edge of the map, her mind visualizing the layout from memory. He's not just stealing, he's systematically dismantling the region's horse trade. Control, Jacob suggested. Destroy enough bloodlines, enough documentation, and suddenly, anyone wanting quality horses has to go through him. There's worse, Sheriff Donovan continued, his voice grave. 2 of the raised ranches had connections to your military past. The Russell place was owned by a former Army quartermaster who supplied your unit. The Thompson spread belonged to a retired colonel who recommended you for the audio targeting program. The implications were clear. Harlow wasn't just attacking random targets. He was methodically eliminating anyone connected to Marion's past successes. A distant flash caught her attention. Sunlight reflecting off glass from the ridge. "Down!" she commanded. Everyone dropped as a shot kicked splinters from the porch post. Sniper, professional work, using the sun's glare for cover. Marion had already calculated the distance, factoring in wind and elevation. "Ethan, my Winchester, the one with the modified stock." The young man returned with the weapon. Marion took careful aim, not at the sniper's position, but at a rock face 30 feet to their left. Her shot cracked off the stone, sending fragments spraying toward the hidden marksman. A figure scrambled. From cover, beating a hasty retreat. "Warning shot?" Jacob asked. "Message," Marion corrected, letting them know their range estimation was wrong. Sheriff Donovan whistled softly. "That's got to be 800 yards. Not many can make that kind of shot." "Even indirectly. Harlow knows now," Jacob observed. "If he didn't already," Marion nodded. "He's testing defenses, probing for weaknesses. That sniper was meant to rattle us, make us nervous." Instead, the shot had confirmed something important. If Harlow was testing her shooting abilities at this stage, it meant his plan was still developing. He wasn't ready for a full assault yet. "Sheriff," she turned to Donovan, "I need you to get word to the federal marshal. Tell them Harlow's not just after horses. He's waging a personal vendetta, and he's using military tactics to do it." "They won't intervene without clear jurisdiction," Donovan warned. "No, but they can alert other law enforcement, set up containment." Marion paused. "And they can investigate why his actions seem to follow old military patrol routes, almost like he had access to official maps." The sheriff's eyes widened at the implication. "You think he has help inside the military? I think a man this methodical, this well-informed, has to have sources. Find them." After Donovan departed, Marion gathered her small council. "Jacob, alert your hands. Double watches, no one rides alone. Ethan, get word to your father's friends at the Blackfoot Reservation. Their people know these mountains better than anyone. We'll need those skills soon. Lisa rides to town and tells Dr. Collins to prepare for casualties. This won't end clean." As they dispersed to their tasks, Marion returned to studying the terrain with her enhanced hearing. Harlow's strategy was becoming clear. Isolate, intimidate, then strike. But he'd made a crucial mistake by revealing his presence too early, by letting her confirm her shooting skills were intact. He'd given her time to prepare, and Marion Sullivan had learned far more in the past 7 years than just ranching. Twilight bled across Clearwater Valley, painting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers toward Marion's ranch. The evening began with an unexpected visitor, Amy Russell, youngest daughter of the neighboring Russell Ranch, galloping through the main gate as if demons chased her heels. "They took everything!" Amy's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "Not just the horses. They burned the stables, destroyed Papa's workshop, said it was a message for anyone who helped the Echo Hunter." Marion steadied the girl's trembling hands. "Start from the beginning. When?" 4 hours ago. 15 men, maybe more." Amy's words tumbled out. "Led by a man with a scarred face. Not Harlow, someone else. They knew things, Mrs. Sullivan. Knew about Papa supplying your unit years ago. Said anyone who'd aided the Echo Hunter had to pay." Lisa emerged from the house, medical supplies in hand. "You're bleeding, Amy." The girl glanced at her arm, seemingly surprised by the blood staining her sleeve. "One of them tried to stop me from riding for help. I hit him with a pitchfork." "Good girl," Marion approved, noting how Amy had instinctively taken the most difficult trail to follow in the dying light. "Where's your family?" "Safe." Papa led them to the old hunting cabin when we first spotted riders approaching. He made me wait until they were distracted with the horses, then sent me to warn you. Amy's voice broke. "But Thunder, our best stallion, they didn't just take him, they shot him. Said quality horses were only for quality people." Marion's jaw tightened. Harlow's lieutenant was sending a message. Not just destruction of property, but deliberate cruelty, breaking spirits as well as livelihoods. Jacob Freeman rode in from his evening patrol, his horse's gait conveying urgency. Smoke. On the horizon, 3 directions: Russell Place, Miller Ranch, and looks like the Thompson spread too. "They're hitting multiple targets, dividing our response." Marion nodded, recognizing the tactic. "Military strategy, force us to split our resources." "They're targeting anyone connected to your past," Lisa finished. "The Russells supplied your unit, the Millers housed your training group, and Colonel Thompson recommended you for the program." Marion considered the timing of these attacks. "New moon tonight," she observed. "Perfect conditions for their main thrust." Lisa caught her meaning. "You think the ranch raids are a diversion?" "Harlow's too methodical for random destruction. He's herding us like cattle into a corral." Marion turned to Jacob. "Your father still has those maps from his army days, the ones showing the old cavalry patrol routes?" "In his office, but get them. Bring them to the old line shack up on Eagle Ridge. And Jacob, don't take the main trail." As Jacob rode out, Marion gathered her remaining allies. "Amy, you'll stay here with Lisa. Ethan, find Billy Thompson. Tell him to spread word in town. Anyone who's ever had a connection to my military service needs to disappear tonight." "What about you?" Lisa asked, noting Marion checking her weapons with practiced efficiency. "I'm going to spring Harlow's trap." At their startled looks, she continued, "He's expecting us to fortify the ranch, concentrate our defense here. That's why he's hitting other targets, to make us hunker down, wait for him to come to us." "But that's exactly what he wants," Amy protested. "No," Marion's smile held no warmth. "He wants us scared, defensive, reacting instead of acting. We're going to give him something else entirely." She mounted Whiskey, the stallion sensing her mood and dancing with controlled energy. "Lisa, you're in charge here. Signal system as we discussed. 3 shots means pull back to town. 2 means call in Donovan and his deputies. 1 shot means you've got a clear target." "But Marion, going out alone." "I won't be alone." Marion checked her rifles one final time. "I'll have an army of shadows on my side. Jacob's people know every trail, every hiding spot. While Harlow's men are busy watching the ranch, a dozen eyes will be watching them." Ethan stepped forward. "Pa's friends from the reservation are already in position. High passes, water holes, anywhere they might try to move stolen horses through." Marion nodded approval. "Remember, Harlow expects the Echo Hunter to be a performer, someone who needs an audience. He's forgotten that the best hunters work in silence." As she rode out, Marion touched the small leather pouch at her belt. Not ammunition, but something more precious. Inside lay a piece of paper she'd found in Thomas's documents after his death. Something written the day before his sudden heart attack, a letter she'd only discovered last month, hidden in a false bottom of his desk. "My dearest Marion," it read in raised lettering she could feel with her fingertips. "If you're reading this, then the past has finally caught up to us. I've known since Virginia that Harlow wouldn't let his humiliation rest. That's why I've spent years preparing, mapping trails, establishing networks, making sure you'd have everything you need when he finally surfaced. The Echo Hunter wasn't just a military designation, love. It was a prophecy. Show them why. Marion tucked the letter away, focusing on the task ahead. Harlow had spent years plotting revenge, thinking he was hunting a retired military asset. Instead, he'd started a war with someone who'd spent those same years learning every secret of these mountains, building alliances with people he'd never even notice. The first stars emerged as Marion guided Whiskey into the shadowed valleys. Behind her, the ranch lights beckoned like a trap ready to be sprung. Ahead, darkness promised concealment for those who knew how to use it. Harlow wanted to face the Echo Hunter. Fine, but this confrontation wouldn't be under controlled conditions. For military observers, this would be a demonstration of why some legends are born in shadow, not spotlight, and why a woman who could track targets in pitch darkness might be even more dangerous in her own territory. The mountain paths whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Marion caught movement to her left, Lucas White Eagle materializing from the underbrush like a spirit. The 17-year-old Blackfoot boy had inherited his grandfather's gift for moving silently through the wilderness. "Mrs. Sullivan," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to her enhanced hearing. "They have men at Three Creeks Pass, 6 riders, heavily armed. They're setting up something, metal tripods with communications equipment. Radio relay stations," Marion realized. "They're creating a communications network." She studied the terrain. Through her other senses, the way sound traveled across the ridgelines, the pattern of night breezes funneling through the passes, the distant vibrations of horses moving across rocky ground. "What else have you seen?" "Their horses are nervous, eastern bred, not mountain stock. They keep spooking the mountain lion's scent, and they've positioned men wrong for night work, facing into the western slopes where evening shadows will blind them." Marion smiled. Harlow's men might be military trained, but they were making fundamental mistakes in mountain terrain. Errors that stemmed from relying on sight rather than sound, from fighting the environment rather than working with it. "Time to begin," she told Lucas. "Tell Jacob to remember our signal system. When the sounds start, hit every relay station. Let's show them why mountain warfare isn't like cavalry charges on open plains." As she guided Whiskey deeper into the darkness, Marion felt the weight of Thomas's letter against her heart. Her husband had known this day would come and had spent years preparing for it. Now she understood why he'd insisted she maintain her skills, why he'd helped her build such strong connections with the local families. Harlow thought he was facing a lone, blind woman past her prime. Instead, he was about to confront someone who commanded an invisible army, who knew these mountains like she knew her own heartbeat. He'd spent years nurturing his revenge, but she'd spent that same time building something far more powerful. A community bound by loyalty and respect. Let him spring his trap. Let him think he had her cornered. Marion Sullivan was about to teach Major Ryan Harlow the difference between military technology and mountain justice, and this lesson would be written in gunpowder and starlight in a language only the Echo Hunter could fully understand. The moonless night cloaked the mountains in velvet darkness as Marion positioned herself on the ridge overlooking Harlow's communication stations. Below, his men moved with military precision, unaware that their supposedly secure perimeter had already been compromised. Through her enhanced hearing, amplified by the device she'd taken from her chest, she counted 14 operatives at the main signal post, their uniforms a mix of tactical gear and civilian clothing. A distinctive pattern of footsteps caught her attention, someone approaching from the northeast ridge with a slight limp in their left leg. The way he carried himself, back straight, shoulders squared, head constantly scanning in measured sweeps, told Marion everything she needed to know. Major Ryan Harlow had finally emerged to oversee his operation personally. Even at this distance, she could detect how the years had changed him. The confident stride she remembered from Virginia had grown more controlled, more deliberate. His voice, when he barked orders at his men, carried the sharp edge of barely contained rage. He gestured toward the valley with quick, aggressive motions. As his men maintained strict formation, "Quite a force he's assembled," Sheriff Donovan whispered, materializing beside her position. The lawman had shed his usual formal attire for dark clothing that blended with the shadows. "My count shows 28 men, all ex-military or security contractors. Some I recognize from federal wanted lists, deserters, mercenaries, men with personal grudges against proper authority." Marion nodded, noting how Harlow's soldiers maintained strict spacing even in their casual movements. "He's rebuilt his command, replacing the men he lost in Honduras. But these aren't just hired guns, they're true believers. Listen to how they defer to him, the lack of casual conversation, the way they move in sync without verbal commands." Spotted something else, Donovan continued. "Supply wagons coming in through Crystal Pass, but they're not just carrying provisions. Saw specialized transport equipment, the kind used for moving high-strung horses long distances." "He's planning to take more than just whiskey," Marion realized. "He wants every valuable horse in the valley, building his own breeding operation, with stolen bloodlines." Movement in the underbrush announced Lucas White Eagle's arrival. The young Blackfoot's approach was so silent that only Marion's enhanced hearing could detect it. His dark eyes reflected starlight as he surveyed the enemy position. "My grandfather counted their weapons," he reported in a soft voice. "Many rifles, new models, and something else. Boxes marked with military stamps. Tranquilizer guns, perhaps. For taking horses without noise." Marion's mind raced through implications. He's not just planning to steal horses, he's going to make sure no one can rebuild afterward, destroy the competition completely. Donovan shifted uneasily. "That's not all. Got word from my contacts in the Federal Marshal's office. They found evidence someone's been accessing military personnel files, specifically yours, and anyone connected to your service record." "The local traitor," Marion murmured. "Any leads?" "Nothing solid, but whoever it is has enough authority to redirect law enforcement patrols away from this area. We're on our own out here." A brief exchange of radio static from the valley drew their attention. One of Harlow's men was testing their communication equipment, sending a practice signal. Marion smiled grimly as she recognized the pattern. "They're using old military codes, predictable." Lucas's expression turned crafty. "My people know these codes. In the border conflicts, we learned to intercept messages, change their meaning with small adjustments. When the radio is operating incorrectly, the message says something very different." "Perfect." Marion's mind was already forming plans. "We'll let them establish their network, get comfortable with it. Then, when they depend on it most, we feed them false information." Donovan nodded. "But Marion, something's been bothering me." "Why now? Harlow's had years to plan this. Why choose this particular moment?" Before she could answer, Lucas went perfectly still, his body language signaling immediate alert. "Riders approaching from town. 2 men moving fast. One has a badge that catches moonlight." Marion's blood ran cold. "Deputy Parker," the one man in the sheriff's office she'd never quite trusted. "Lucas, get your best scouts. I need eyes on those riders. Don't engage, just listen." The young Blackfoot melted into the darkness. Marion turned to Donovan. "Sheriff, I need you back in town. Something's not right. Parker shouldn't be out here." "You think he's the leak?" "I think we're about to find out." As Donovan departed, Marion caught a glimpse of another signal from the rocks to her right. 3 quick flashes reflected from a mirror in moonlight. Jacob Freeman's position on the opposite ridge. Urgent news. She worked her way carefully through the darkness, using every trick she'd learned in years of navigating without sight to move silently over treacherous ground. Jacob waited in a natural hollow, his expression grim in the faint starlight. "Found something in one of their abandoned camps," he whispered, handing her what felt like a leather-bound notebook. "Military reconnaissance log. Detailed observations of every ranch in the valley, including daily routines, security measures, breeding records. Marion's fingers traced the pages, finding notations in the margins. These aren't just observations, they're operation parameters, staging points, extraction routes, contingency plans. There's more. Jacob's voice hardened. Found notes about Thomas's death, detailed medical assessments, speculation about heart conditions and untraceable toxins. The implications hit like physical blows. "They killed him," Marion whispered, cold fury replacing shock. "Poisoned him to get him out of the way, then watched me grieve while planning this." "This changes everything," Jacob said softly. "No." Marion straightened, ice replacing the momentary fire in her voice. "This clarifies everything. Harlow's not just here to steal horses or humiliate me. This is about erasing every trace of my life, my husband, my ranch, my reputation. Total destruction." Jacob touched her arm gently. "Marion, get to your position," she interrupted, her voice steady once more. "Tell your people to prepare for my signal. Harlow thinks his night vision equipment and military precision guarantee victory. Time to show him why the Echo Hunter earned her name in darkness. A bird call split the darkness, Lucas White Eagle's signal for urgent news. Moments later, the young Blackfoot appeared beside Marion, his approach so silent that only her enhanced hearing could detect it. "The deputy," he reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "He meets with Harlow's men at the old mining shed. Give them papers, maps. They speak of moving tonight before the federal marshals can arrive." Marion checked her weapons with cold precision. They're accelerating their timeline. Something spooked them. "Word from the marshal's office, maybe," Jacob suggested. "If they know Donovan has been asking questions." "Doesn't matter." Marion's voice carried absolute certainty. "They've played their hand. Now we play ours." She turned to Lucas. "Get these documents to Sheriff Donovan. He'll need them to prove the conspiracy." To Jacob, she gave different instructions. "Alert your riders. When my signal comes, hit their communications first. Harlow's men need to be blind and deaf." "And Deputy Parker?" Lucas asked. "Leave him to me." Marion mounted whiskey, feeling the stallion's eagerness beneath her. "The deputy needs to learn what happens when you betray not just a woman, but an entire community." As her allies melted into the darkness, each to their assigned tasks, Marion surveyed the valley below through her enhanced hearing. Harlow's men continued their preparations, unaware that their carefully laid plans were already unraveling. They expected to face a single adversary, the legendary Echo Hunter, making one last desperate stand. Instead, they would face an entire community united against them. Every person Harlow had dismissed as unimportant, Native Americans, black ranchers, women they'd underestimated, had become part of an invisible army preparing to strike. Marion touched Thomas's letter still carried close to her heart. Her husband had understood something Harlow never would. True strength wasn't in military might or careful plans. It was in the bonds between people, the loyalty earned through years of mutual respect and support. The night wind carried sounds of preparation from the valley, men checking weapons, horses being readied. Let them prepare. Let them think there. Superior numbers and military precision guaranteed victory. They were about to learn why the Echo Hunter had chosen this particular valley for her retirement. "Jacob," she called softly, "have your people start moving the hidden horse herds further. Into the mountains. Not just mine, everyone's best breeding stock. We'll need them to rebuild." Sarah Collins received different instructions when she arrived moments later. "Your clinic, it needs to be ready, not just for injuries but for treating shock and exposure. And Sarah, prepare for the worst. These men won't show mercy." Lucas White Eagle's task was perhaps most crucial. Your people know the old ways, the paths that don't appear on any map. When the shooting starts, you'll need to get the children and elders to safety. Use the routes we discussed. As her allies departed to their tasks, Marion made one final preparation. From a hidden cache in the rocks, she retrieved a package wrapped in oiled canvas. Inside lay her original military equipment, not the demonstration gear, but the practical tools she'd used in actual operations. The audio enhancement devices were still cutting edge, the specialized ammunition precisely arranged for tactical access. Every piece had been designed not for show, but for survival in absolute darkness. Been a long time, Donovan observed, returning from his reconnaissance. Not as long as they think. Marion checked the equipment's functions by touch and sound. Thomas insisted I practice with it monthly. Said skills were like gardens, needed regular tending. Your husband was a wise man. Wiser than I knew. Marion's voice softened slightly. He saw this coming all those years ago. He wasn't just helping me maintain skills, he was helping me prepare for war. A flash of radio static from the valley signaled Harlow's men beginning their final preparations. Marion gave Donovan last-minute instructions. When you see the signal fires on Eagle Ridge, move your deputies into position. Not before. We need Parker to think his plan is working until the last possible moment. And Harlow, Marion's smile, was cold as mountain frost. Let him focus on the Echo Hunter. Let him think this is about settling an old score. By the time he realizes what he's really facing, it'll be too late, because Harlow had made a fatal error in his calculations. He thought he was facing a legend past her prime, a single blind woman he could break through superior force. Instead, he was about to confront something far more dangerous, a community united, fighting not just for horses or land, but for their very way of life. And at their center, riding out of darkness like an avenging spirit, the Echo Hunter was about to demonstrate why some legends are best left undisturbed. Dawn was still hours away as Marion made her way to the old mining shed where Lucas had spotted Deputy Parker meeting with Harlow's men. The night cradled her in familiar darkness, a realm where her disability transformed into her greatest strength. Each sound, the soft rustle of pine needles, the distant call of a nighthawk, the subtle shift of small creatures moving through underbrush, built a detailed acoustic map more precise than any visual image. She detected Parker's presence before. She reached the shed. His breathing pattern, slightly labored from the climb up the ridge, was distinctive, as was the particular creak of his gun belt when he moved. He was alone, waiting for someone, his agitation evident in the rhythm of his pacing. Awful late for a deputy to be out here alone, Marion called from the shadows, her voice seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere. Parker's heart rate spiked. Marion could hear the sudden acceleration. "Who's there?" His gun cleared leather. With a metallic whisper, "You know who I am, Parker." She moved silently to a new position as he turned toward her original voice location. "Question is, who are you really working for?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Sullivan." His voice strained for normalcy but couldn't hide the tension. "Just doing my rounds." "Funny sort of rounds that take you to private meetings?" "With Harlow's men." She circled him in darkness, her movements utterly silent. "Interesting sort of deputy who passes along ranch defense plans and patrol schedules." Parker fired blindly into the darkness, the shot illuminating his panicked face for an instant before shadows reclaimed him. "Stay back. You helped them kill Thomas, didn't you?" Marion's voice came from a completely different direction now. What was it? Poison in his medication? Something to make it look like a heart attack? I didn't know they'd go that far." The admission tumbled out before he could stop himself. "They said it was just about horses, about a business opportunity. Harlow promised a percentage, said no one would get hurt." But people did. "Get hurt?" Marion circled closer. "The Anderson boy, the Wilson hand, how many others, Parker?" The deputy fired again, wildly. "You don't understand. Harlow's got connections, military intelligence, federal agencies. Cross him and you disappear. I didn't have a choice. We always have choices. Marion's voice was directly behind him now. Thomas taught me that. Even in darkness, especially in darkness, we choose who we are. Parker whirled, but it was too late. Marion struck with precision, disarming him with a move she'd perfected years ago. The deputy found himself suddenly weaponless, facing a woman whose unseeing eyes somehow fixed on him with unnerving accuracy. "How many others are involved?" she demanded. "Who else betrayed this valley?" "Just me and the sheriff's office," Parker gasped, clutching his twisted wrist. "But Harlow has someone in the Federal Marshal's Service, someone who redirects investigations, buries reports. I don't know who." "And Thomas?" Parker's silence told her everything. Marion's grip tightened. It was just supposed to be heart medication, he finally admitted. Something to make him sick, not kill him. But Harlow changed the dosage without telling anyone. Said a blind widow would be easier to manipulate than a protective husband. A cold fury swept through Marion, but she contained it, channeling it into focus rather than vengeance. "You're going to help us make this right, Parker. Harlow will kill me." "That's a possibility," Marion acknowledged. "But I guarantee Sheriff Donovan will arrest you if you don't. Your choice, face justice or face Harlow." When Jacob and Lucas arrived minutes later, they found Deputy Parker writing a full confession, his hand shaking, but his words steady. The document detailed everything: the conspiracy, Thomas's murder, the planned raid on Marion's ranch, the mole in the Federal Service. "Get this to Donovan," Marion instructed, handing the confession to Lucas, "and Parker goes with you under guard." As they led the deputy away, Jacob studied Marion with concern. "Are you all right? Finding out about Thomas this way, I always suspected his death wasn't natural," Marion admitted. "He was too healthy, too careful, but confirmation—" She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It changes nothing about tonight's plan. If anything, it makes our purpose clearer." The next hour brought final preparations. Throughout the valley, Marion's allies moved into position, Jacob's riders securing high ground, Lucas's people establishing escape routes for non-combatants, Donovan's loyal deputies creating a perimeter to contain Harlow's forces. Marion returned to Eagle Ridge, where she could monitor the enemy's movements through sound. Harlow had consolidated his men into 3 groups, one at the main camp, one approaching from the East Ridge, and a third circling toward her ranch from the south. Classic pincer movement, designed to trap a single target between converging forces. "They're moving according to plan," Jacob reported, joining her at the observation point. "Heading right for the ambush points." Marion nodded, satisfied. Harlow's military thinking was becoming his greatest weakness. He was fighting the last war, using tactics designed for conventional battlefields. But this wasn't a military campaign. This was mountain justice, where terrain and community trumped firepower and numbers. A new sound caught her attention, distinctive footsteps approaching from the North Trail. "Dr. Collins," she identified the newcomer before Sarah came into view. "I thought you'd want to see this," Sarah said, pressing a journal into Marion's hands. "Found it among Parker's things when I treated his wrist. It's a medical log, detailed. Notes on Thomas's condition, observations on drug interactions, timing of doses." Marion's fingers traced the pages, finding notations in a neat clinical hand. "These aren't Parker's notes." "No," Sarah confirmed grimly. "They're Dr. Harrison's, the physician who treated Thomas. He was working with them too." The discovery added another layer to the conspiracy. Dr. William Harrison had been the valley's most respected physician, the man who'd pronounced Thomas's death natural causes, who'd comforted Marion afterward, who'd continued to prescribe her medication for years. "That's how they tracked your routines," Sarah continued. "Regular appointments, prescription refills, all opportunities to observe your patterns, map your property, plan their approach." Marion absorbed this information with outward calm, but internally her fury built like a gathering storm. This wasn't just about horses or military humiliation anymore. This was about a systemic betrayal, about men who'd exploited her blindness and her grief, who'd killed her husband and planned to destroy everything she'd built. "Where is Harrison now?" she asked. "Gone," Sarah replied. "Left town 3 days ago, claimed a family emergency back east, but according to these notes he was supposed to meet Harlow at a rendezvous point after the raid. With detailed medical records on everyone in the valley," Marion concluded. "Names, conditions, weaknesses, everything a paramilitary force would need to control a population." The scope of Harlow's plan was becoming clear. This wasn't just a personal vendetta or a horse theft operation. This was preparation for something larger, territorial control perhaps, or a base for future operations. The valley's isolation, initially appealing for its privacy, had made it a perfect target. Sarah's hand found Marion's shoulder. "There's something else you should know. The medication Harrison prescribed for you after Thomas died, I had it analyzed. Low-dose sedatives meant to dull reflexes, slow reaction times. He's been drugging you for years, Marion." The revelation explained subtle changes Marion had attributed to grief and aging, occasional disorientation, dulled senses, unpredictable fatigue. She'd stopped taking the pills 3 weeks ago when they'd run out, and had felt increasingly alert since. "They've been preparing for this moment for years," Marion realized. "Watching, waiting, keeping me compromised until they were ready to strike." "But you're clear now," Sarah confirmed, "and they don't know that." The tactical advantage of this new information wasn't lost on Marion. Harlow expected to face a sedated woman with diminished reflexes and dulled hearing. Instead, he would confront the echo hunter at her full capacity, in terrain she knew intimately, with allies he'd never anticipated. "It's almost time," Jacob observed as full darkness settled over the valley. "Harlow's men are moving into the final position." Marion activated her audio enhancement equipment, the familiar weight settling around her ears like an old friend. Immediately, the soundscape expanded dramatically. She could detect movement half a mile away, could distinguish between different types of weapons being prepared, and could hear Harlow himself issuing final orders to his lieutenants. "He's telling them to take me alive," she reported, listening to the distant conversation. "I want to make an example, apparently. The horses are secondary now. This has become personal for him." "Good," Jacob replied grimly. "Let him be distracted by vengeance. Makes our job easier." Marion made her final checks, ensuring every piece of equipment functioned perfectly. The ammunition Thomas had specially designed for her, rounds that traveled true, through any weather condition, that made minimal sound when fired, that left no distinctive signature, was arranged for quick access. "Remember," she instructed. The small group gathered around her. "This isn't just about defending my ranch. This is about the future of this valley. If Harlow succeeds here, other communities will face similar threats. We're fighting for more than horses or personal justice." As her allies moved to their positions, Marion took a moment alone. Her enhanced hearing captured the night's 1,000 voices, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant movement of nocturnal animals, the subtle creaking of trees adjusting to temperature changes. This was her realm, more intimately known to her than to any sighted person. She thought of Thomas, of the life they'd built together, of his foresight in preparing her for this moment, her grief and rage transformed into something cooler, more focused, a precision tool rather than a blunt weapon. Harlow had spent years planning this operation, assembling men and resources and establishing intelligence networks. But he'd missed the most critical intelligence of all, understanding who Marion Sullivan truly was, beyond her military record and public reputation. He thought he was hunting the Echo Hunter, the military asset who'd humiliated him years ago. But that woman was just a shadow of who Marion had become. In the years since losing her sight, she'd developed abilities beyond any training program's parameters. She'd learned to read the mountains with her ears, to track by sound alone, to detect lies in a heartbeat's subtle change, to shoot with a precision that didn't require eyes. More importantly, she'd built something Harlow couldn't comprehend, a community that functioned like a single organism, where each person's strengths complemented the others, where loyalty wasn't commanded but freely given. While Harlow collected mercenaries bound by payment and fear, Marion had gathered allies bound by mutual respect and shared purpose. A distinctive pattern of static in her audio equipment signaled Lucas White Eagle's scouts were in position. 3 quick clicks from her right confirmed Jacob's riders had secured the high ground. A single long tone indicated Sheriff Donovan's deputies had established their perimeter. Everything was ready. Marion mounted Whiskey, the stallion moving, with perfect confidence, even in darkness. Together, they would write the final chapter of a story that had begun years ago in a Virginia training facility. A story Harlow thought would end with his triumph and her humiliation. But this was her land, her people, her fight. And in the darkness of Clearwater Valley, the Echo Hunter would demonstrate why some legends grow stronger with time, and why underestimating a blind woman might be the last mistake Ryan Harlow would ever make. Through her enhanced hearing, Marion detected Harlow's voice a quarter-mile away, addressing his men before their final advance. His words carried clearly across the night air. "Remember, the Echo Hunter is mine," he instructed. "Disable, but don't kill her. I want her to see everything she's built destroyed before she dies." One of his lieutenants, a man with a distinctive Australian accent, questioned the order. "She's blind, Major, can't see anything." Harlow's laugh carried a cruelty that confirmed everything Marion had sensed about him years ago. "That's the beauty of it, Foster. We'll describe it to her in detail. Every horse taken, every building burned, every ally captured. Break the legend by breaking the woman." Marion smiled grimly in the darkness. For all his intelligence gathering and tactical planning, Harlow still fundamentally misunderstood her. He thought her blindness was a weakness to exploit rather than a different kind of strength. He believed taking her sight had diminished her, when in truth it had transformed her into something beyond his comprehension. "It's time," she whispered, more to herself than to the night. With a subtle pressure from her knees, she guided Whiskey toward the ridge trail, not retreating from the coming conflict, but positioning herself at its center. Because while Harlow had spent years dreaming of revenge, Marion Sullivan had spent those same years becoming the very essence of her legend. Not just the Echo Hunter of military fame, but something new, something that could only have emerged from darkness and loss. A woman who had learned that sometimes, to truly see, one must first be blind. The night was about to teach Harlow that painful lesson, written in a language only Marion fully understood, the language of echoes and shadow, of loyalty and justice. Long delayed, the first phase of Marion's plan began not with gunfire, but with silence. As Harlow's forces spread through the valley's lower reaches, they encountered a landscape mysteriously emptied of life. No cattle lowed in pastures, no hands-patrolled fence lines, no lights glowed from bunkhouses or barns. The Sullivan Ranch appeared abandoned, a ghost property standing dark against the night sky. Marion listened from her position on Eagle Ridge as confusion rippled through Harlow's command structure. His lieutenants reported the absence of expected resistance, the missing livestock, the seemingly deserted buildings. Through her enhanced audio equipment, she heard Harlow's frustration mounting. "It's a trap," he snapped at his subordinates. "Sullivan's no fool. She knew we were coming. Sweep the buildings, check for ambush points, maintain formation." But the standard military response to a suspected ambush, methodical clearing operations, moving from building to building, played directly into Marion's strategy. Every minute Harlow's men spent searching empty structures was another minute for her allies to move into position. Another opportunity for the invaders to reveal their patterns and weaknesses. First team in position, Jacob Freeman whispered. Through the compact radio Thomas had modified years ago for Marion's use. The device transmitted on frequencies Harlow's military equipment wouldn't monitor, using an encryption system Thomas had designed specifically for this contingency. Second, team ready, came Lucas White Eagle's confirmation moments later. Deputies in place, Sheriff Donovan added from his position overlooking the southern approach. Marion checked her timepiece by touch, its raised markers easily discernible under her fingertips. Right on schedule. Hold positions until my signal. Across the valley, her Confederates waited in perfect stillness, Jacob's ranch hands occupying the high ground above Harlow's communication relay points, Lucas's Blackfoot hunters positioned along escape routes, Donovan's deputies blocking the mountain. The passes. The trap wasn't at the ranch. It encompassed the entire valley. Through her audio equipment, Marion tracked Harlow's growing impatience as his teams reported finding nothing but empty buildings and cold fireplaces. His voice carried a brittle edge when he ordered a second team to approach the main house. She can't have gone far, he insisted. Find me something. Anything that tells us where Sullivan's hiding. Marion allowed herself a small smile. Harlow still thought in conventional terms, searching for physical evidence, expecting standard evasion tactics. He couldn't conceive that she might be tracking his every movement, listening to his every order through technology he believed only his forces possessed. His men approached the ranch house with professional caution, maintaining proper spacing and cover techniques. They entered through multiple points, executing a textbook clearing operation. Main floor clear, one reported. Upper level secure, added another. Then came the report that sent a ripple of confusion through Harlow's command. Boss, you need to see this. Marion heard Harlow enter the house, his distinctive footsteps, left leg slightly heavier than right, from an old injury she remembered from Virginia, moving directly to the study. There, prominently displayed on Thomas's desk, lay a single sheet of paper. What the hell is this? Harlow demanded. Looks like a map, his lieutenant replied. But it's not like any map I've seen. No visual markings, just raised dots and lines. Marion smiled in the darkness. Thomas had helped her create that tactile map years ago, a detailed representation of the valley that she could read by touch, showing acoustic anomalies, sound channels, and natural amplification points that only someone who navigated by hearing would understand or value. To Harlow's men, it appeared meaningless, perhaps a blind woman's useless attempt at cartography. But to Marion, it represented the valley's true nature as a soundscape, revealing paths and positions invisible to the eye. It's useless, Harlow dismissed after examining it. Focus on finding Sullivan, not deciphering her scribblings, his fundamental. Misunderstanding of how Marion perceived her environment continued to be his greatest vulnerability. While his men searched for visual clues, they remained deaf to the acoustic signatures that were guiding Marion's every decision. Move to Phase 2, she instructed through her radio. Within moments, her instructions rippled across the valley through their secure communications network. The first indication that Harlow's operation was facing unexpected resistance came when his communication relay station suddenly went silent. Jacob's riders, moving with precision timing, had disabled the equipment without firing a shot, disconnecting power sources, removing key components, and vanishing back into the darkness before Harlow's technicians realized what had happened. Comms down in sectors 3 and 4, a panicked voice reported through Harlow's remaining radio network. Equipment's been sabotaged, professionally. Components missing, not just damaged. Marion heard Harlow's sharp intake of breath, the sound of a man whose carefully constructed plan was beginning to unravel. How? Who? We cleared those areas. Unknown, sir. No shots fired, no signs of struggle. Equipment was operational 15 minutes ago during standard check-in. Get them back online now. Harlow's voice carried the edge of someone unaccustomed to having his commands questioned or his plans disrupted. But restoring communications wouldn't be simple. Jacob's people had taken the most crucial components, replacing some with decoys that would appear functional during cursory inspection, but fail under operational stress. As Harlow's technicians scrambled to restore their network, Phase 3 of Marion's plan commenced. Throughout the valley, carefully positioned sound reflectors, devices Thomas had designed based on Marion's understanding of acoustic principles, began broadcasting pre-recorded sounds of movement, weapons being prepared, and tactical communications. 2. Harlow's men. It suddenly seemed as if they were surrounded by a force much larger than anticipated, approaching from multiple directions. The audio deception, combined with their compromised communications, created precisely the uncertainty and confusion Marion had intended. Contact North Ridge. Movement East Sector. Possible hostiles approaching from the creek bed. The reports flooded Harlow's remaining communication channels, his men reacting to phantoms created by carefully calibrated sound projections. Their night vision equipment, designed to amplify available light, offered no defense against purely auditory deception. Marion tracked the resulting chaos through her enhanced hearing, noting how Harlow's disciplined operation began to fragment as teams repositioned to address non-existent threats, breaking carefully established formations and security protocols. "They're splitting up," Jacob reported with satisfaction. "Just like you predicted." "They're fighting blind now," Marion replied. "Time for Phase 4. This next stage represented the most audacious element of her strategy. While Harlow's attention remained focused on phantom threats, Sarah Collins led a small team of ranch hands in a precision operation targeting the invaders' supply wagons. Their objective wasn't to destroy the supplies, but to substitute them, replacing ammunition with identically weighted blanks, swapping specialized equipment for non-functional replicas, and most importantly, exchanging the tranquilizers intended for the horses with harmless saline solution. Sarah's medical knowledge proved invaluable as she handled the delicate tranquilizer substitution. "Done," she reported 15 minutes later. "They won't know the difference until they try to use them." Marion nodded, satisfaction warming her despite the night's chill. When Harlow's men attempted to capture the valuable horses, they'd find their carefully prepared tranquilizers useless, forcing them to choose between abandoning the primary objective or attempting to handle high-strung, valuable animals without chemical assistance. Through her audio equipment, Marion heard Harlow, gathering his lieutenants at the ranch house, his voice tight with controlled fury as he reassessed the situation. "This is coordinated resistance," he told them. "Not just Sullivan. The entire valley is working against us." "Impossible," his Australian lieutenant objected. "Our intelligence was solid. Sullivan's isolated, a blind widow with minimal support. The locals fear her more than respect her." "Then explain the communication sabotage," Harlow countered. "Explain the coordinated movement patterns we're detecting. Someone's organized these people." Marion smiled grimly. Harlow's intelligence had indeed been flawed, not through operational failures, but through fundamental misunderstanding. He'd interpreted her privacy as isolation, her neighbors' respect as fear, her quiet competence as vulnerability. Most critically, he'd assumed her blindness rendered her incapable of coordinating effective resistance. "Sir, we should abort," another lieutenant suggested. "Regroup, reassess, return with better intelligence." "No!" Harlow's fist striking the table carried clear through Marion's audio equipment. "Sullivan's here somewhere. She's coordinating this. Find her and the resistance collapses." His fixation on Marion personally, rather than the operational challenges facing his men, represented another critical error. While Harlow focused on finding one woman, the entire community was systematically dismantling his carefully planned operation. "He's sending search teams into the high country," Lucas reported, his scouts tracking the movement of small units, breaking away from the main force. "Let them come," Marion replied. "The night has 1,000 voices, and none of them are friendly to Harlow's men." The search teams entering the rugged terrain of the upper valley encountered an environment deliberately altered to confuse and disorient. Lucas's people had spent days preparing the landscape, rearranging trail markers, creating false paths that led nowhere, establishing subtle barriers that channeled movement into predetermined areas. More disorienting for Harlow's men were the sound traps, carefully positioned devices that activated when someone passed nearby, creating dislocated noises that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A twig breaking behind them, footsteps ahead, whispered conversations just beyond visual range, all manufactured to create the impression of being surrounded by an invisible enemy. "Second search team is completely turned around," Lucas reported, with quiet satisfaction. "They think they're heading back to the rendezvous point, but they're actually moving deeper into the box canyon." "Perfect," Marion acknowledged. "Jacob, status on Harlow's remaining communications?" "Down to their last relay station. They're consolidating forces to protect it, exactly as you predicted." The predictability of Harlow's responses continued. To be his greatest weakness, trained in conventional military doctrine, he reacted to the systematic dismantling of his operation by drawing his forces closer, establishing defensive perimeters, attempting to secure what remained of his command. Structure, textbook responses, if one were fighting a conventional enemy, but Marion Sullivan was anything but conventional, and the battlefield she'd created operated on principles Harlow couldn't begin to comprehend. "Move to Phase 5, she instructed, checking the raised markings on her tactical timepiece. Right on schedule. Throughout the valley, her allies synchronized their watches. At precisely the agreed moment, the final communication relay at Harlow's disposal went silent. Not through sabotage this time, but through a focused electromagnetic pulse from a device Thomas had acquired years ago through his military contacts. The localized EMP disabled not just communications, but night vision equipment, tactical computers, and any other electronic devices within its radius. For the first time, Harlow's men found themselves truly blind in the darkness. Their technological advantages neutralized, their formations scattered, their intelligence proved false, and their commander increasingly focused on personal vendetta rather than tactical reality. "They're vulnerable," Sheriff Donovan observed. "We could take them now, end this before dawn." "Not yet," Marion cautioned. "Harlow's still dangerous, perhaps more so in desperation. We need him to make one more mistake." That mistake came sooner than expected. With his operation disintegrating around him, Harlow made the decision Marion had anticipated from the beginning. He took personal control of a small strike team and headed directly for the location Parker had identified as most precious to her, the secluded meadow where Thomas was buried. "He's taking the bait," Jacob confirmed, his scouts tracking Harlow's movement. 6 men with him, heading straight for Thomas's resting place. Marion checked her weapons one final time. "Perfect. Now we shift to the endgame." She guided Whiskey down from her observation point, moving silently through terrain she knew by heart. The stallion, trained to respond to the slightest pressure, from her knees and weight shifts, navigated the difficult trail without hesitation. They were headed for an intercept point, a natural amphitheater where sound traveled with exceptional clarity, where Marion's advantages would be maximized and Harlow's remaining resources neutralized. "All teams, final positions," she instructed, through her secure radio. "Remember, Harlow is mine. Focus on containing his men." Across the valley, her allies acknowledged and moved to their assigned locations. The trap was nearly complete. Not the ambush Harlow might have expected, but something far more comprehensive. A complete inversion of combat dynamics where his strengths become weaknesses and Marion's supposed disability transformed into her greatest asset. As she positioned herself at the natural amphitheater's edge, Marion reflected on how thoroughly Harlow had misunderstood the nature of this confrontation. He'd approached it as a military operation against a compromised target, bringing equipment and tactics designed for conventional warfare. But this wasn't conventional warfare. This was Marion Sullivan defending her home on terrain she'd mapped. Through sound rather than sight, supported by a community whose loyalty he'd dismissed as irrelevant. Using strategies based on acoustic principles, his technology-dependent approach couldn't counter. Through her enhanced hearing, she tracked Harlow's approach. His team moved with professional care but increasing frustration. Their communications down, their night vision disabled, their confidence eroding with each setback. Their commander's growing anger manifested in his breathing pattern, the cadence of his footsteps, the tension evident when he spoke to his men. "She's playing us," Harlow told his team, unwittingly broadcasting his position to Marion's waiting ears. "Sullivan always was tricky. Smoke and mirrors disguised as skill, but we've got one advantage she can't counter." He paused, and Marion could almost hear the cruel smile in his voice. "She cares about this place, about Sullivan's grave. That makes her predictable. She'll defend it, and when she does, we'll have her." Marion allowed herself a small smile in the darkness. Harlow's fundamental misunderstanding continued to be his undoing. He assumed she would react emotionally, abandoning strategy for sentiment. He couldn't conceive that Thomas's resting place had been deliberately included in her tactical planning from the beginning, positioned to draw Harlow exactly where she wanted him. "They've entered the southern approach to the amphitheater," Lucas reported softly. 30 seconds to optimal position." Marion drew her custom rifle from its scabbard, the familiar weight settling against her shoulder with practiced ease. The weapon, like everything Thomas had modified for her, was an extension of herself, balanced for her grip, adjusted for her unique requirements, loaded with ammunition designed to travel true under any conditions. "All teams in position," Jacob confirmed, "waiting for your signal." Marion took a deep breath, tuning her enhanced hearing to its most sensitive setting. She could detect Harlow's team settling into what they believed were covered positions, unaware that in the amphitheater's unique acoustic environment, every whisper, every shifted weight, every nervous swallow traveled directly to her waiting ears. "This is for you, Thomas," she whispered, too softly for even her radio to transmit. Then, louder, "Execute." Across the valley, her allies moved with synchronized precision. Signal fires blazed to life on surrounding ridges, not for illumination, but for timing, visual markers for those who needed them. Simultaneously, the sound reflectors Thomas had designed years ago activated in a carefully orchestrated sequence, creating a disorienting cascade of echoes that made it impossible for those in the amphitheater to determine direction or distance. Harlow's men reacted with predictable confusion, their training undermined by sensory disorientation. They fired at phantoms, wasting precious ammunition on targets that existed only as acoustic illusions. Their discipline cracked further as Marion's allies began applying pressure from multiple directions. Not direct assaults, but strategic positioning that cut off retreat routes and limited tactical options. Throughout this carefully orchestrated chaos, Marion remained absolutely still, tracking each of Harlow's movements through sound alone. His increasing desperation manifested in his breathing pattern, the crescendo of his pulse audible to her enhanced hearing, the subtle shift in his weight as he prepared to move to a new position. The moment had come. With mathematical precision, Marion calculated the shot, factoring in temperature, humidity, the subtle cross-breeze she could feel on her face, the specific acoustic signature of Harlow's position. Her finger settled on the trigger, muscle memory from thousands of hours of practice guiding the motion. The first indicator that Harlow's carefully planned operation had completely unraveled came not from gunfire or surrender, but from his own voice, cutting through the darkness with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Sullivan!" he called out, his tone revealing the desperation he could no longer conceal. "I know you're out there. This doesn't have to end badly. We can negotiate." Marion remained silent, letting the weight of darkness and uncertainty press down on him. Through her enhanced hearing, she detected the subtle changes in his physiology that indicated mounting fear. The accelerated heartbeat, the shallow breathing, the minute tremor in his voice. "Think about it logically," he continued, his words echoing in the natural amphitheater. "I've still got men throughout the valley. One word from me and they burn everything you've built. Is that what you want? For what? A few horses?" His desperate attempt at negotiation from a position of weakness confirmed what Marion already knew. Harlow had lost control of the situation. His operation was in shambles, his men scattered and disoriented, his technological advantages neutralized. All that remained was the final confrontation between the man who had orchestrated her husband's murder and the woman whose abilities he had fatally underestimated. "It's over, Harlow," Marion finally responded, her voice seemingly coming from everywhere at once, thanks to the amphitheater's unique acoustics. "Your men are contained, your communications are down, your operation has failed. Nothing's over. Until I say it's over." Harlow fired blindly toward the source of her voice, but Marion had already shifted position, moving with the silence that years of navigating without sight had perfected. "You never did understand," she continued from a completely different location. "In Virginia, on this mountain, you never grasped what you were really facing. A blind woman with a reputation bigger than her abilities," Harlow snarled, pivoting toward her new position, but finding only darkness. "No," Marion replied calmly. "Someone who sees through darkness better than you ever could through light." As dawn's first pale glow began to illuminate the eastern sky, the final act of this long-planned confrontation was about to begin. The echo hunter and the man who had murdered her husband would face each other one last time. But unlike their encounter in Virginia years ago, this meeting would take place on Marion's terms, in a darkness where only she could truly see. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Marion detected a change in Harlow's tactics. Through her enhanced hearing, she tracked his movement, no longer the confident stride of a military commander, but the careful, measured pace of a man who knew he was being hunted. "Sullivan!" he called out, his voice betraying frustration beneath the forced confidence. "I'm impressed. Truly, this isn't the blind widow act I expected." Marion remained silent, shifting position with ghost-like precision. The natural amphitheater carried his voice to her from all directions, but her trained ears could pinpoint his exact location from the subtle acoustic signature of his breathing, the whisper of his clothing against the undergrowth, the distinctive cadence of his movement. "You've had your fun," he continued, pivoting slowly as he tried to locate her. "But this little resistance of yours can't hold together much longer. My men will regroup, and when they do—" "Your men are already contained," Marion finally responded, her voice seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere, thanks to the amphitheater's unique acoustics. "Sheriff Donovan has your lieutenants in custody. The federal marshals have been alerted to your operation. There will be no regrouping, Ryan." The use of his first name, a deliberate rejection of his military rank, sent a visible shock through Harlow that Marion could detect in his sudden intake of breath. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. No longer was this a military operation against a civilian target. It had become a personal confrontation between equals, one that Harlow was increasingly unprepared for. "So the blind shooting instructor remembers me," he recovered, his voice taking on a mocking edge. "I'm flattered. Did you think about me often these past years, Marion, during those lonely nights after Thomas died?" Marion circled silently, her boots finding secure footing through memory and the subtle changes in ground texture she could detect through Whiskey's movements. "I thought about you only recently," she replied, her tone conversational, almost friendly. "When I found Thomas's letter explaining how he'd been preparing for your eventual appearance. He knew you better than you knew yourself, Ryan." Thomas. Sullivan was a civilian contractor who got lucky once. Harlow spat, his composure cracking further. "He caught me by surprise in Virginia. That doesn't make him a prophet." "No, but it made him cautious, thorough." Marion shifted position again as she spoke, noting how Harlow's remaining men were growing increasingly disoriented by her seeming omnipresence. "He knew men like you don't just disappear after humiliation. They fester, plan, obsessed. So he prepared, not just equipment and tactical advantages, but people, connections, a community that would stand together when the time came." Through her enhanced hearing, Marion detected the subtle change in Harlow's breathing, the slightly elevated heart rate, the minute tremor in his hands that translated to a faint metallic whisper as they tightened on his weapon. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he had severely misunderstood the nature of his opponent. "Enough talk," he snapped, his patience evaporating. "You've had your ranch hands run interference, played your sound tricks, but at the end of the day, Sullivan, you're still blind, and I'm still the man who put 12 shots through 12 targets while you were fumbling for your fancy audio equipment." In Virginia, Marion allowed herself a small smile, undetectable in the pre-dawn darkness. "Is that how you remember it, Ryan?" "Strange. The official record shows something quite different." "Records can be manipulated," Harlow fired back. "Just like reputations can be manufactured. The legendary Echo Hunter, nothing but a parlor trick with good publicity." "Then why are you here?" Marion's question hung in the air, devastatingly. Simple. Why assemble an entire paramilitary force, spend years planning, kill my husband if I'm just a trick with good publicity? The question struck home with precision. Marion could hear in Harlow's sudden stillness, the momentary pause in his breathing, the subtle shift in his stance. She had maneuvered him into a logical trap as effective as any physical one. Either she was the fraud he claimed, making his elaborate operation absurdly disproportionate, or she was exactly what her reputation suggested, making his current predicament potentially fatal. Before he could formulate a response, the confrontation entered a new phase. On ridges surrounding the amphitheater, signal fires blazed to life, not randomly, but in a precise pattern that Marion had established with her allies. To the casual observer, they might appear to be nothing more than position markers. To Marion, they created acoustic reference points, subtle changes in air temperature and movement that her hypersensitive hearing could detect and interpret. "Pretty light show," Harlow observed with forced nonchalance. "But theatrics won't save you, Sullivan." "There, not for me," Marion replied simply. "I don't need light to see." With those words, she implemented the next stage of her strategy, one that would demonstrate precisely why the Echo Hunter had earned her legendary status. The ground beneath them seemed to come alive with sound, subtle vibrations transmitted through specially positioned resonators that Thomas had embedded years ago, creating an acoustic map that only Marion could navigate. To Harlow and his men, the effect was profoundly disorienting. The earth itself appeared to be speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Marion moved with absolute confidence through this acoustic landscape, each step guided by frequencies and patterns calibrated specifically for her enhanced hearing. It was like navigating a familiar room by memory, except the room was a mountain wilderness, and the memory was encoded in sound rather than sight. What the hell is this? One of Harlow's men broke formation, firing wildly into the darkness as the disorienting resonances intensified. "Hold position!" Harlow commanded, but his authority was eroding with each passing moment. His carefully selected team, chosen for their adherence to military discipline, was unraveling in the face of warfare. They had never been trained to confront. Marion continued her methodical approach, using the acoustic environment as both weapon and shield. Thomas had designed this system based on her unique abilities, a defensive network that transformed the natural amphitheater into an extension of her senses. Each step brought her closer to Harlow, while simultaneously making her more difficult. For him to locate. "Your men can't help you now, Ryan," she called, her voice seeming to emanate from multiple directions simultaneously. "This isn't Virginia anymore. You're not evaluating a training program in controlled conditions. You're in my home." As if to emphasize her point, Marion executed a series of shots that demonstrated the full extent of her capabilities. 3 rapid-fire rounds struck within inches of Harlow's position, close enough to shower him with debris, but carefully calculated to avoid injury. Not warning shots, but a precision demonstration. "Impossible," Harlow breathed, the word barely, audible to normal hearing, but crystal clear to Marion's enhanced senses. "No one can shoot like that in darkness, not even with night vision." "I don't use night vision," Marion replied, genuine amusement coloring her voice. "Never have. That was your fundamental misunderstanding in Virginia, Ryan. You thought I was using technology to compensate for conventional limitations. You never grasped that I was developing entirely different sensory pathways." The revelation landed with impact she could hear in his sudden stillness, the moment of comprehension that transformed his understanding of both past and present. In Virginia, Harlow had convinced himself that Marion's abilities were technologically enhanced, that her audio targeting was supplemented by hidden visual aids or computer assistance. It was the only explanation his ego would accept for her superior performance. Now, confronted with evidence he could no longer deny, Harlow faced the truth. Marion Sullivan didn't just shoot well despite being blind. She shot with supernatural precision because of it. Her blindness had forced her to develop auditory processing, capabilities beyond anything Harlow had encountered in his military career. That's why the drugs didn't work, he realized aloud, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Harrison said the sedatives should have compromised your reflexes, dulled your hearing. They did, for a while, Marion acknowledged, continuing, her careful positioning as they spoke. But the human brain adapts, especially when pushed. The medication you had Harrison prescribe actually forced me to develop even more acute compensation mechanisms. By the time I stopped taking the pills 3 weeks ago, my auditory processing had evolved beyond your medical consultant's models. This information that Marion had been aware of the drugging attempt and had not only overcome it but leveraged it to enhance her capabilities, visibly shook Harlow. Through her enhanced hearing, Marion detected his increasing physiological stress, elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, the subtle hormonal changes that accompanied the realization of profound miscalculation. Your entire operation was built on flawed intelligence, Ryan, she continued, her voice carrying no malice, only professional assessment. You evaluated me based on who I was 7 years ago in Virginia, not who I came out here with. You saw my blindness as a vulnerability, to exploit rather than understanding it as the foundation of entirely different capabilities. As dawn's first true light began to illuminate the amphitheater, Marion implemented the final phase of her acoustic strategy. Throughout the surrounding ridges, her allies activated the last of Thomas's sound devices, specially designed reflectors that created focused auditory illusions. To Harlow's men, it seemed as if they were suddenly surrounded by dozens of approaching figures, the sounds of weapons being prepared coming from all directions. The effect was immediate and devastating. Military discipline, already strained by the night's events, collapsed entirely. 2 of Harlow's men broke and ran, only to be smoothly intercepted by Jacob's riders positioned along the escape routes. Another dropped his weapon, raising his hands in surrender as Sheriff Donovan's deputies emerged from concealed positions. Through all of this, Marion maintained her focus on Harlow himself. Her enhanced hearing tracked his increasingly erratic movements, the desperate pivot from one perceived threat to another, the gradual realization that his carefully assembled force had been systematically neutralized, not by superior numbers or firepower, but by a strategic approach he hadn't been trained to counter. "It's over, Ryan," she called, allowing him to finally pinpoint her location as she stepped into a clearing. The rising sun illuminated her figure, not the frightened widow he had expected to terrorize, but a woman of formidable presence, her rifle held with casual competence, her unseeing eyes hidden behind specialized glasses that enhanced her auditory perception. "Nothing's over until I say it's over," Harlow snarled, raising his weapon with military precision, but Marion had already calculated his response. Before his finger could tighten on the trigger, her shot struck with surgical accuracy, not a killing blow, but a disabling one that sent his weapon spinning from his grasp. "Actually," she corrected calmly, "it's been over since the moment you set foot in Clearwater Valley, with the intention of harming my people." Harlow clutched his injured hand, his face contorted with a mixture of pain and disbelief. How? The single word contained volumes. How had she outmaneuvered him? How had she shot with such precision? How had everything he'd planned so meticulously collapsed so completely? "You're a visual thinker, Ryan," Marion explained, approaching him, with confident steps that belied her blindness. "You plan in terms of what you can see, what can be mapped visually, what can be verified by observation. It never occurred to you that an entire dimension of tactical information existed that your methods couldn't access." As Sheriff Donovan and his deputies secured the remaining members of Harlow's team, Marion confronted her husband's killer directly. Standing before him, she removed her specialized glasses, revealing eyes clouded by injury, but radiating an intelligence and awareness that transcended physical sight. "I want you to understand something," she said, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "This wasn't just about stopping you or protecting my horses. This was about showing everyone what happens when you underestimate people based on what you perceive as weakness." Harlow's response was unexpected, a harsh laugh that contained equal parts frustration and genuine appreciation. "You know what's truly ironic, Sullivan? If the military had listened to your audio targeting programs instead of shutting them down after your injury, I might have had the training to actually fight you effectively tonight." The observation contained a truth Marion had recognized years ago. Her methodologies had been deemed too specialized, too difficult to standardize. After her demonstration program ended, the military had reverted to visual-dominant tactical approaches, leaving the audio targeting techniques she'd pioneered largely unexplored. "That was always the fundamental disconnect," she acknowledged. "You believed technology could replace human sensory development. I argued that technology should enhance natural capabilities, not substitute for them." As Donovan's deputies led Harlow away, the rising sun fully illuminated the valley below. From her position, Marion could hear the distinctive sounds of Clearwater Valley awakening, cattle being moved to fresh pasture, distant voices as her allies secured the remaining members of Harlow's force, the particular cadence of hoofbeats that identified Jacob Freeman approaching her position. "It's done," Jacob reported as he reached her side. "Harlow's entire operation was neutralized, not a single casualty on our side. A few minor injuries among his men, nothing serious." Marion nodded, satisfaction evident in her relaxed posture. And the horses? All safe. Lisa and Ethan moved them to the high pastures exactly as planned. Those special tranquilizers Harlow brought, Sarah switched them for saline solution. When his men tried to use them on the Anderson stallions, nothing happened. A smile touched Marion's lips at this confirmation that every element of her strategy had functioned as intended. The operation hadn't been improvised resistance. It had been the culmination of years of preparation, the execution of contingency plans Thomas had helped her develop and that she had refined through constant practice. "There's something else," Jacob added, a new note in his voice catching Marion's attention. "Federal Marshal Reeves is here. Says he has information about how Harlow accessed your military records, who helped him plan all this." Marion tilted her head slightly, processing this development. "Bring him up." Minutes later, she heard the approach of unfamiliar footsteps, a measured military cadence that identified the newcomer as someone with formal training. "Mrs. Sullivan," a deep voice greeted her. "Federal Marshal James Reeves. I want to personally thank you for what you've accomplished here today." "Marshal," Marion acknowledged with a slight nod. "Do you have any information?" "Yes, ma'am." Pages rustled as Reeves consulted documents. "We've identified Harlow's source within the Federal Service, a former intelligence officer named Victor Mercer. He provided classified personnel files, tactical assessments, even medical records, been feeding information to Harlow for years, helping him plan this operation." "Motivation?" Marion asked, her mind already mapping connections. "Mercer was present at your Virginia demonstration," Reeves explained. "He was the intelligence liaison who argued against implementing your audio targeting protocols, claiming they were too resource-intensive for general deployment. When several special operations teams requested your training anyway, he lost considerable professional standing." The pattern was familiar. Another man whose ego couldn't accept being proven wrong by Marion's methods. So he helped Harlow plan his revenge as a proxy for his own. "Exactly," Reeves confirmed. "We've had suspicions about Mercer for months, but couldn't prove anything until now. The documentation your people provided, particularly Deputy Parker's confession and Dr. Harrison's medical logs, gave us everything we needed to move against him. This represented the final piece of the puzzle, the explanation for how Harlow had accessed information that should have been securely classified, how he had coordinated an operation of this magnitude without triggering federal attention sooner. The conspiracy had extended further than Marion had initially suspected, reaching into the upper echelons of the very agencies tasked with preventing such threats. "There's more," Reeves continued. "Based on the evidence recovered from Harlow's camp, we've identified at least 3 other communities targeted for similar operations. Isolated ranching areas with valuable livestock, minimal law enforcement presence, and strategic geographical advantages. Harlow wasn't just planning to steal your horses, he was establishing a permanent base of operations." The scale of what they had prevented suddenly expanded in Marion's understanding. This hadn't been merely about personal vendetta or high-value theft. It had been the first phase of a larger criminal enterprise that would have devastated communities throughout the region. "Marshal Reeves," she said after processing this information, "I'd appreciate a full briefing once you've completed your investigation. If other communities are at risk from similar operations, they should be warned." "Yes, ma'am," Reeves agreed. "And if you'd consider it, the Federal Marshal Service would value your input on identifying vulnerable areas and developing countermeasures. Your understanding of how Harlow's operation was neutralized could save a lot of lives." The request represented an unexpected turn, an opportunity to transform her defensive strategies into proactive protection for other communities. It was precisely the kind of meaningful purpose Marion had sought when developing her audio targeting protocols years ago, before her injury had seemingly closed that path. As Marshal Reeves departed to coordinate with Sheriff Donovan, Marion remained at the amphitheater's edge, listening to the valley below. The sounds carried clear in the morning air, ranch hands returning to their duties, horses being brought down from safe pastures, neighbors checking on one another after the night's events. Jacob remained beside her, his presence comfortable in its familiarity. Quite a night, he observed after a long, companionable silence. More than that, Marion replied thoughtfully. A turning point. Because in neutralizing Harlow's threat, Marion Sullivan had done more than protect her ranch and community. She had demonstrated capabilities that transcended conventional tactical thinking, revealed the potential of methods that had been dismissed by military orthodoxy, and perhaps most importantly, transformed perception of blindness from limitation to specialized advantage. The woman known as the Echo Hunter had emerged from darkness, not diminished, but evolved. Her legend now built not on military demonstration or specialized training, but on the practical defense of home and community against overwhelming odds. And as the sun rose fully over Clearwater Valley, illuminating a landscape Marion would never see but knew more intimately than any sighted person could claim, she understood that this night had been about more than survival or justice. It had been about reclaiming her true legacy, not as a military asset or a curiosity, but as a pioneer of human potential who had transformed so-called disability into unprecedented capability. The revelation of these hidden depths, both her own and those of the community that had stood with her, would reshape not just their valley, but potentially the very understanding of human sensory potential. And for Marion Sullivan, that represented a victory far more significant than simply defeating Ryan Harlow's forces. It represented the future. 1 year after Harlow's failed operation, Clearwater Valley had transformed in ways few could have predicted. The attempted raid that was meant to destroy Marion Sullivan's legacy had instead crystallized it, creating ripples that extended far beyond Wyoming's borders. The autumn air carried crisp promise as Marion stood on her porch, listening to the familiar sounds of her ranch. Horses in the corral, hands calling to each other as they completed morning chores, the distinctive cadence of approaching riders that her enhanced hearing identified before they crested the hill. Right on time, she remarked, as Sarah Collins and Federal Marshal Reeves dismounted in the yard. The training team is assembled in town, Reeves reported, climbing the steps. Representatives from 7 counties, just as you requested. They're eager to begin. Marion nodded, satisfaction evident in her relaxed posture. The Echo Hunter training program had evolved from concept to reality with remarkable speed after the federal government recognized the potential of her methodologies. What had begun as defensive tactics for a single valley had expanded into a comprehensive approach to rural security. And the equipment, she asked. Arrived yesterday, Sarah confirmed. Thomas's designs manufactured to your specifications. The acoustic mapping devices, sound reflectors, specialized ammunition, everything. The mention of Thomas brought a brief smile to Marion's face. His foresight, preparing not just for Harlow's attack, but for what might come after, continued to guide developments a year after the confrontation. The systems he had designed specifically for Marion's abilities now served as prototypes for equipment being deployed to vulnerable communities throughout the Western Territories. Jacob and Lucas are already working with the advanced team, Sarah added, teaching tracking methods, terrain adaptation, community coordination, all the elements that made our defense successful. The training program represented more than tactical instruction. It embodied a fundamental shift in approach. Rather than imposing standardized security protocols, it emphasized identifying and leveraging each community's unique strengths, the specialized knowledge of indigenous populations, the interconnected support networks of ranching communities, and the terrain familiarity of local inhabitants. Have you had a chance to review the Justice Department report? Reeves asked, his tone suggesting the significance of the document. Sarah read it to me yesterday, Marion confirmed. Victor Mercer's operation extended further than we initially suspected. The investigation launched after Harlow's capture had uncovered a network of corruption reaching into multiple federal agencies. Mercer hadn't merely assisted Harlow out of professional jealousy. He had been the architect of a sophisticated criminal enterprise targeting isolated communities throughout the Western Territories, using ex-military operatives like Harlow to establish control over strategic areas with valuable resources. 17 indictments now, Reeves reported with satisfaction, including 2 territorial judges and a deputy governor. Your evidence was the keystone that brought it all down. The scope of what they'd prevented still occasionally struck Marion with its magnitude. What had seemed a personal vendetta had been merely one component of a systematic campaign of exploitation and control, one that would have spread to dozens of communities if Clearwater Valley hadn't demonstrated effective resistance. The sound of hoofbeats announced another arrival, Ethan Freeman, now 17, and carrying himself with the confident maturity of someone who had faced extraordinary challenges and emerged stronger. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called as he dismounted, excitement evident in his voice. "First foals from Whiskey's new bloodline were born at our ranch last night. Pa says they're showing exactly the traits you predicted: calm temperament, strong bone, structure, perfect for mountain terrain." The breeding program Marion had established with Jacob Freeman represented another dimension of Clearwater Valley's transformation. The horses Harlow had intended to steal were now foundational to a cooperative enterprise that crossed traditional boundaries of race and background. The Freeman-Sullivan bloodlines were becoming recognized throughout the territories for their exceptional qualities. "And the training methods?" Marion asked, referring to the specialized approach she'd developed for working with horses through sound and touch rather than visual cues. "Working exactly as you taught us," Ethan confirmed. "We've got buyers from 3 territories interested in learning the methods. They're calling it Sullivan Training now, becoming its own brand." This, too, represented an unexpected legacy. Marion's adaptations to blindness, initially developed for personal necessity, had evolved into innovations that changed fundamental approaches to horsemanship. Techniques born from limitation had become advantages that sighted trainers now sought to incorporate. The valley itself had changed, adapting while maintaining its essential character. After the confrontation, communities that had previously existed in relative isolation discovered the strength of coordination. The network established to resist Harlow's forces had evolved into permanent connections between ranchers, townspeople, and the Blackfoot community, trading resources, sharing knowledge, and establishing mutual protection systems. "The governor's representative arrives tomorrow," Reeves mentioned as they moved inside for the scheduled briefing. "He's bringing the official recognition we discussed." Marion nodded, remembering the proposal that had initially seemed inconceivable. Clearwater Valley was being officially designated as a training center for rural security, with federal funding to support the programs Marion had developed. What had begun as desperate defense had transformed into a model for community protection throughout the territories. "Still can't believe how much has changed in a year," Sarah observed as they settled around the kitchen table, the same table where 12 months earlier they had planned their resistance against seemingly overwhelming odds. "The valley was always capable of this," Marion replied, arranging her papers with practiced efficiency. "It just needed a catalyst to reveal its potential." The room filled gradually as other key figures arrived for the briefing. Sheriff Donovan, now heading a regional law enforcement coordination program, Lucas White Eagle, whose Blackfoot Scouts had formalized their role as territorial security advisors, and Lisa Carpenter, who had transformed from ranch hand to Marion's chief administrative coordinator. Together, they represented the new equilibrium that had emerged from the crisis, a community that had discovered its collective strength and now shared that knowledge with others facing similar threats. Before we begin, Marion addressed the assembled group, I want to acknowledge what each of you contributed. This isn't my program or my legacy. It belongs to everyone who stood together that night and everyone who continues building what we started. As the briefing proceeded, plans discussed, responsibilities assigned, future developments mapped, Marion occasionally found her thoughts returning to Thomas. He had seen potential in this valley that others missed, and had recognized something special in its people that warranted extraordinary preparation. His final gift hadn't been just the tools and systems for defeating Harlow. It had been the foundation for everything now emerging. When the meeting concluded and the participants dispersed to their various responsibilities, Marion returned to her porch. The afternoon sun warmed her face as she listened to Clearwater Valley's symphony of sounds, each one distinct and meaningful to her trained ear, each representing an element of the community that had become so much more than the sum of its parts. Whiskey approached from the corral, his distinctive gait immediately recognizable. The stallion nudged her hand gently, a greeting between old friends who had faced danger together and emerged victorious. We did all right, didn't we? She murmured, stroking his sleek neck. The distant sound of children's laughter carried from the direction of town, the future generation growing up in a valley that had transformed threat into opportunity, isolation into connection, perceived weakness into extraordinary strength. Marion Sullivan, once known as the Echo Hunter for her military skills, now carried that title for entirely different reasons. She had become a symbol of how communities could echo and amplify their collective strengths, how apparent limitations could generate unexpected capabilities, and how the darkest moments often preceded the most profound transformation. As she had told Harlow during their final confrontation, sometimes, to truly see, one must first be blind. The legacy of Clearwater Valley, of a blind widow who shot by sound alone and in doing so revealed the hidden potential of an entire community, would continue to echo through the territories for generations to come. And, for Marion Sullivan, that represented the most meaningful victory of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.